How many of you have read The Purpose-Driven Life? Wow! You all can't see this, but just about everybody's hand went up. One of the quotes from that book that I love so much is that our character is essentially the sum of our habits. Now, did you hear that? Our character is essentially the sum of our habits. And Dallas Willard, one of my favorite authors, in The Spirit of the Discipline, said that we can become like Jesus by doing one thing, by practicing his lifestyle, his habits. So when I think about leading like Jesus, I first have to think about becoming like Jesus. Now that's an awesome thought to me, that I could become like Jesus. But you know, that was the goal that God had in mind for us in the very beginning, that we were to become like Jesus. And so when we think about leading like Jesus, we really have to look carefully at what were the habits that kept Jesus focused. We've heard so many people talk today about vision. Well, where did his vision come from? We've had so many people say today, you know, we get off track easily. Jesus never got off track. He stayed focused all of the time. So let's look at what was that? What was that in his life that kept him on track and focused? I believe that it was his habits. First habit that I think about when I think about Jesus was obviously the time he spent with his Father. When we look at Mark 1:35, the first thing we read is very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, went to a solitary place to pray. And when the disciples went to look for him, they knew where to find him. So that tells me they must have found him there before. Jesus prayed. He made it very clear throughout Scripture that he didn't do anything that the Father didn't tell him to do. He said, I do everything the Father tells me. Well, how did he find that out? Except that he spent time with him. You and I have to do the same. If Jesus cleared his calendar to spend time with the Father, I think we better do that too. Prayer is critically important. And the disciples were so impressed about Jesus' prayer life, they could have asked him anything. They could have said, teach us how to do better miracles. Teach us how to heal better. Teach us how to love more. But you know what they asked him? You know, teach us to pray. And Jesus did. He gave them this incredible framework of prayer that begins and ends with praise and worship of the Father. And in between praise and worship, gave us a great framework of how to pray. Praying our priorities, praying about our personal relationships when he talked about forgiveness, talking about daily provision for our lives. You know, that's the hardest part about life, is that it's daily. And then praying about our protection. He gave us everything in that one prayer. One thing that I've experienced in my own life is that I have seen prayer change things and circumstances. But the thing prayer does most in my life is that it changes me. Have you noticed that? You go to God and you say, you know, I've got my agenda in my head, and Lord, this person needs to change. Their attitude is so bad. And before I know it, God has pointed that back at me and says, now wait a minute. Wait a minute. Let's look at your heart. Let's look at who you are. So prayer, the first habit that we need to consider and practice. And we know that Jesus knew Scripture. We know as he was tempted, 3 times he said, it is written, it is written, it is written. And then he quoted Scripture. He used Scripture every time. He knew his way around Scripture. In Luke 5, we've already talked about Luke 5 one time today, but there's a passage there where he was given Isaiah to read. And he looks for exactly the verse he wants to read. He reads it and he says, now you see it's come to pass. He knew Scripture. And so one of the habits that we have to do is we have to memorize Scripture, because we're going to need it. I learned this early in my life. When I was 8 years old, I had this incredible opportunity. I had a group of people come to my school, and they offered a camp, a 2-week summer camp, free. It was a great opportunity for me because they had swimming pools, they had all of these great games, tennis courts, and they were going to teach me how to play tennis. I was thrilled. And I thought, this is the best thing I've ever heard about, especially since it was free. The only thing I had to do was memorize 300 Bible verses. 300. Well, I was 8 years old, and it didn't seem like a big task to me, so I thought, okay, I could do that. And so I took this plan home, and they gave you this whole little brochure that you got, and you have all your verses to memorize by the week. And I took it home to my parents, and they thought it was a great idea too. And so we began to plan how we were going to do that. I was going to get up at 6 o'clock every morning, and my father and I were going to pray, and then I was going to memorize. Every day I would repeat the verse that I memorized for that day, the verses, and at the end of the week I had to say all the verses for the week, and my dad would sign off on this paper that I had that I'd memorized those verses. Well, that's what we did. I got up every morning, 6 a.m., from the beginning of the school year till the end of the school year. And every morning my father prayed and I prayed. And my daddy prayed, Lord, help her to remember these Scriptures and plant them as seeds in her heart. I'll never forget that. Well, I worked very hard. The other caution that a dad would say, you dads would know this, now if you start this, you know you're going to finish it. So I was sure of that, and I was also sure that Daddy was not into ad-libbing Scripture, so I had to get it right every time. So we began that process, and we finished. By the end of the year, I had memorized 300 Bible verses. I was thrilled. I was so excited. Time came. I was ready to go to camp, and I had not considered a couple of things there that were really important. One, I was 8 years old, and I had never been away from home in my life. And number two, I was the only one in my class that had decided to do this, so I didn't know anyone at camp. So I was getting a little apprehensive about going to camp. But as the day came, I got excited about it, and we went to camp. But about Wednesday of the first week of my 2-week reward, I was ready to go home. I had already swam in the pool, and I had played tennis, and I was done. And I was so homesick. I thought, if they don't come get me, I'm going to die in this place. I know it. So I called my mother, and I said, you've just got to come. And she reminded me of how hard I'd worked for a whole year to go to camp. I said, I know, but I can't stay. You've got to come get me. And she persuaded me to stay until Saturday, so I'd have at least one full weekend. It was torture. It was absolute torture to stay any longer, but I stayed. And when they came to pick me up on that Saturday, I was really frustrated with myself. Number one, that I had not gotten my full reward for all that hard work. So I went home, and I was mad. I was mad about it. I had worked so hard. And you can see this little 8-year-old person thinking, I worked so hard and I didn't get what I was supposed to get. But I didn't know what the real reward was. Because you see what I learned. I learned in Isaiah 43 that I never had to be afraid. That God had called me by name and I was His. I learned in Psalm 17 that I was the apple of God's eye. Can you imagine? I learned in Jeremiah 29:11 that He had a plan for my life. I learned in Jeremiah 33:3 that I could call to Him and He would answer me and tell me great and mighty things I did not know. I learned in Ephesians 2:5 that I was supposed to have the same attitude of Jesus. I learned in Ephesians 3:20 that He would do immeasurably more than I could ask or imagine And I remember when I read that verse, I thought, Lord, now I have a big imagination. And I learned in Romans 8:28 that God works for good for those who love Him. And so much more. I never knew how those seeds would be planted in my heart. Many years later, one beautiful spring day, we got up in my family, and by this time I'd been married for 22 years, and my son was a sophomore in college, and my daughter was a junior in high school, so many years later. It was such a beautiful spring day. I couldn't imagine how great our world was that day. And I remember we were very busy that morning. We had lots of things going on. And it was a Saturday actually after Easter, and my son had been home from college the weekend before, so we were still talking about that. You know how when your children go away, it's so good to have them come home. But we had gotten together for lunch that day, my daughter and my husband and I. And we had eaten and we had cleared the table off, and my husband was going to go mow the yard, and he laughed. He said, "Oh man, I have got indigestion." And he said, "I guess that's what I get for eating 3 chili dogs." And I laughed too. And as we thought about that, we just laughed and didn't think anything about it. I went upstairs to study, and he went out to mow the yard. Well, it wasn't very long that I heard really heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. And I ran to the bedroom door, and my husband was standing in front of me, obviously in excruciating pain. And he fell in front of me. And I screamed for my daughter to call 911. She did that, and then she also called our neighbor that was a doctor. And as we worked on him, trying to do everything we could for him, in my head was Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you. Plans to prosper you, not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. We worked so hard. The medical team came, and they did everything very quickly. They were wonderful people. They got him in the ambulance, and my daughter rode with a neighbor of ours to the hospital, and I got in the front seat of the ambulance. And in my head, I promise you, that verse was like the background going over and over again. And I kept thinking to myself, I know, Lord, you have a plan. I'm trusting this plan, Lord. But I know it's a hope and a future. You say it's a hope and a future. And I was praying as I could hear the siren in my ears, riding down the road. Now when I hear sirens, I stop to pray, because I know what that means for somebody. That siren blaring, looking back every few minutes, seeing what was going on in the back, praying for that medical team, praying for my husband, praying for my son, who by this time we had called and said, come quickly, knowing that he was driving for 2.5 hours from school to get to the hospital. Praying for my daughter, that God would take her fear and be with her. We get to the hospital, and we're immediately taken into a small room, my daughter and I, and they take my husband on. And as we're there, I was amazed at how God continued to speak verses to me to calm me. And I was calming other people. That, all of these things, God works for good. And my daughter and I sat and waited. And it was so incredible. You know how God's people are so wonderful to you. I don't even know how people found out what was going on in our life, but suddenly we had a room full of people loving on us, being with us during that time. The doctor came in. And the doctor said, tell me what happened today. And I repeated to him just what I've repeated to you. And he said, sometimes the first sign of heart disease is fatal. I'm so sorry. There was nothing we could do. And somewhere in my head, I heard, absent from the body, present with the Lord. Just that phrase. Didn't know where that came from right then, but I knew where my husband was. And at the same time I heard that, I heard Jeremiah 29:11 again, but I argued and I said, Lord, you said there was a plan and there was a hope and a future, and this doesn't feel like hope to me. I don't understand. And as soon as that verse left my head, the next one was, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your path straight. And I said out loud, oh, I see, Lord. It's about trusting you. My daughter was sitting in the floor beside the chair I was in, and we sobbed together. We were waiting then. We didn't have cell phones then. This was 14 years ago. And we didn't have cell phones. So my son was on the way to the hospital. And I couldn't call him and say, don't come to the hospital, go home. So we had to wait at the hospital. And the moment that my son got there, I can still see this in my mind. My son was walking through, and I could see the glass door, see him coming. My daughter ran faster than I did, and she got there and she told him about their dad. My son was running in with a Bible in his hand. And he fell to his knees. And the verse that came to my mind was in Psalm 34, the Lord is close to the brokenhearted. And my faith said, Lord, help me trust you and be close to us because we're brokenhearted. Prayer and study of Scripture. I can tell you in the last 14 years that there have been challenges I couldn't have imagined. Incredible challenges. Challenges that I didn't expect. I didn't expect any of that in my life. I had it all planned out. It was going to be very different than it is. But God had a different plan. I will also tell you in my life that I've had blessings in the last 14 years that I couldn't have imagined. My children's marriages to people that I love so much. Beautiful grandchildren. Brilliant grandchildren. I couldn't have imagined that. I couldn't have imagined either that God would bring someone else into my life. Someone else to love me and spend my life with. And I'm grateful. Prayer and study of Scripture. My daddy prayed about those seeds being planted in my heart. They were planted. I wish I could tell you that I've always listened, that I've always heard the voice of God and immediately obeyed. But I haven't. As my friend Ken says, we all fall short of 100. And I love this wonderful story that reminds me about my Jesus. There was a great pianist, and he was to play in a beautiful concert hall. It was going to be a night to remember for everyone. It was tuxedos and long evening gowns. It was going to be spectacular. One mother had brought her 9-year-old son to this extravaganza. Can you imagine? But she wanted to inspire him, you see, that if he saw this master pianist, that he would play the piano as well. So she brought him. Well, as everybody was getting seated and set that night, he was pretty fidgety because he hadn't wanted to come anyway. And he had on this little tux, can you imagine? 9 years old in his little tux. He didn't want to be there. He wanted to be at home playing. And so he was fidgety. As her back was turned, he left his seat. And that beautiful grand piano was on stage, and it called him by name. And so there he goes, down the aisle, unnoticed by anybody until he gets up on stage. And there he is, and he can't help it. He has to touch the keys. And so he begins to play chopsticks. Here they are in this great concert hall, and there's a child playing chopsticks. The people don't notice it first, but all of a sudden they say, "Who is that kid? Get that kid off the stage." And my personal favorite, "Where is his mother?" So the kid really just keeps playing. And so we have this child sitting there, and in the background, there's the master pianist hears what's happened, and he looks out, he sees this child, and without any kind of announcement, he rushes to the stage. And when he gets there, he stands behind the little boy, and he puts one hand on each side, and he begins to play a melody that is perfect with chopsticks, and it becomes beautiful. And as he stands behind the little boy, he whispers in his ear, "Don't stop, son. You just keep playing. Don't stop, son. Keep playing. We're going to finish together." What I hear my Jesus say when I meet with him is, don't stop. You keep meeting with me. You keep studying so you can become like me, so that your automatic response will be the loving response, so that we can forgive easily or easier, so that we can love more freely, so that we can be like Jesus. We can lead like Jesus when we become like Jesus. God bless you.